July 11th, 1944. A hedgerow field south of Saint-Lô, Normandy. A German sniper lay in the shadow of a stone wall, his carabiner 98K wedged into a gap between two rocks. The 4-power Zeiss scope steady on a line of Americans 200 yards away. He had been doing this for 3 years. First outside Leningrad, then at Kursk, then in the Dnieper crossings. He knew what an officer looked like. On the Eastern Front, they were easy. The Soviet officer wore better boots. He carried a leather map case on his hip and a Tokarev pistol in a brown holster. His collar tabs had small metal stars. When he moved through his men, soldiers stiffened. When he stopped, someone handed him binoculars. You could find him in 4 seconds. The German watched the Americans through his scope. 8 men crouched behind a hedgerow, waiting for something. He panned slowly across them, left to right. Same helmet. Every one of them. The same olive-drab steel pot. No markings, no insignia. Same jacket. Same dull green. Same cut. Same pockets. He looked at their weapons. Most carried the big M1 rifle. 2 carried something shorter, but it was still a long arm, slung across the chest, not a pistol in a holster. No one wore a leather cross strap over the shoulder. No one held binoculars. No one had a map case on his belt. No one was being saluted. One of them spoke. The others moved. That was the only sign. One man spoke, and the rest responded. But by the time the sniper registered it, the speaker had already shifted behind the hedgerow, indistinguishable again. He squeezed the trigger and hit the 3rd man from the left. A rifleman. Not an officer, not a sergeant. Just a private, carrying the same gear as everyone else. On the Eastern Front, that shot would have decapitated a platoon. Here, it killed 1 man. The rest kept moving. Someone else gave the next order. The sniper could not tell who. This was not an accident. It was not luck. And it was not one decision made by one general on one afternoon. What made American officers invisible to German snipers was a system. 6 interlocking layers built over 3 years that stripped away every visual marker that armies had used to identify their leaders for centuries. No other nation in the war did this. Not the British, not the Soviets, not the Germans themselves. Only the Americans erased the visible line between the man who gave orders and the man who carried them out. If this story helps you see World War II through a lens you haven't tried before, a like and a subscribe go a long way toward keeping these stories alive. To understand how radical that system was, you have to understand what it replaced. Because for most of human history, the entire point of an officer's uniform was to be seen. Go back to any battlefield before 1941, and the officer is the easiest man to find. He wears a different coat, a finer cloth, a sword belt, or a sash. His headgear is taller, shinier, more decorated. He rides a horse when his men walk. He carries a pistol when they carry rifles. He stands while they kneel. Everything about him says, "I am in charge." This was not vanity, it was doctrine. An officer needed to be recognized instantly by his own men. In smoke, in confusion, in the chaos of a broken line. If your soldiers cannot find you, they cannot follow you. Every army in the world accepted this bargain. Visibility to your own men meant visibility to the enemy. The price was worth paying, and for centuries it was. Because before telescopic sights, before high-velocity rifles accurate to 800 yards, the enemy could not exploit what he saw. A general on a hill was visible, yes, but he was also beyond musket range. The first crack in that bargain came in the American Civil War. At Spotsylvania in 1864, a Union sharpshooter killed Confederate General John Sedgwick, who had just told his men not to worry about enemy fire at that distance. The second crack came at Gallipoli in 1915, where Ottoman snipers learned to pick off British officers by their Sam Browne belts, a leather strap that crossed the chest, worn only by commissioned officers. But the lesson took decades to sink in, and when the next war started, most armies still dressed their officers to stand out. Remember that, because what the American Army did between 1940 and 1944 was not just removing a belt or hiding a rank badge. It was something far more systematic, and it started with a man who understood that the next war would be fought at a distance where every visible distinction was a death sentence. His name was Leslie McNair, and the training system he built would quietly solve a problem that every other army in the world was still dying from. The German army did not start the war with snipers. In 1939, the Wehrmacht had almost no organized sniper program. Marksmanship was valued, but the dedicated sniper, the lone shooter with a telescopic sight, trained in camouflage, stalking, and target selection, was considered a leftover from the trenches. The Blitzkrieg was about tanks and speed. Snipers were slow. That changed in the first winter in Russia. By December of 1941, Soviet snipers were killing German officers at a rate that alarmed divisional commanders across the entire Eastern Front. The Red Army had entered the war with roughly 60,000 trained snipers, more than every other army on Earth combined. And they had a doctrine that no Western army shared: target the leaders first. Not the machine gunner, not the radio man, the officer. Remove the man who thinks, and the men who shoot become a crowd. It worked. German after-action reports from the winter of '41 describe platoons losing 2 and 3 lieutenants in a single week. Company commanders shot stepping out of a bunker. Battalion staff officers killed while raising binoculars. The reports carry a tone close to disbelief. These were not lucky shots. The Soviets were selecting their targets with precision, and the targets were always the men giving orders. The Germans responded the way the Germans usually responded. They built a system. By 1943, the Wehrmacht had established formal sniper schools, pulled the best marksmen from frontline units, and sent them through 3.5 months of intensive training. They learned to shoot. They learned to hide. And, this is the part that matters for this story, they learned to identify officers. The curriculum was specific. A sniper was taught to read the battlefield the way a hunter reads a forest. You do not look for the animal. You look for the signs the animal leaves. An officer does not wear a sign that says, "Shoot me." But he leaves signs everywhere. The first sign is equipment. An officer carries a pistol. His men carry rifles. At 200 yards through a 4-power scope, the difference is unmistakable. A short weapon in a hip holster versus a long arm slung across the body. An officer carries a map case, a flat leather pouch on his belt or across his shoulder. His men do not. An officer often has binoculars around his neck. His men have ammunition pouches. The second sign is clothing. In the Red Army, officers wore better boots, tall leather, while enlisted men often wore rough felt valenki in winter or cheap canvas in summer. Officers' collar tabs carried metal stars and colored piping. The cloth was sometimes finer. The cut of the gymnastyorka tunic was subtly different. And until 1943, Soviet officers still wore a belt with a distinctive brass buckle and often a diagonal cross strap, a holdover from the old imperial tradition, that was visible at considerable distance. The third sign, and the most reliable, was behavior. An officer moves differently. He stops, and the men around him stop. He points, and they look where he points. He stands at the center of a cluster, not at the edge. He receives reports. A runner approaches him, not the other way around. When a formation halts, the officer is the one studying the terrain, not the one lighting a cigarette. German snipers on the Eastern Front became experts at reading this grammar. Sepp Allerberger, an Austrian marksman in the 3rd Gebirgsdivision, who would be credited with over 250 kills, described how he could identify a Soviet officer within seconds of scanning a position. The boots, the holster, the way men oriented toward him like iron filings around a magnet. Allerberger did not need to see a rank badge. The body language was enough. And the payoff was devastating. Kill a Soviet platoon's officer, and for 30 seconds to a minute, the platoon stalled. Men looked around. No one moved. In that window, a good sniper could take a second shot. The sergeant, the next man who stepped forward to lead. 2 shots, 2 kills, and a platoon of 40 men became ineffective, until someone from the rear came forward to take command. It could take 10 minutes. In a firefight, 10 minutes was eternity. By 1943, this was standard practice across the German front. Snipers hunted officers the way a predator hunts the lead animal in a herd. The visual markers were so reliable that German sniper trainers compiled them into checklists. Pistol, map case, binoculars, better clothing, central position, receiving reports. Any 2 of these together, and you had your target. Then, those snipers, the ones who had spent 2 years perfecting this craft in Russia, were transferred west. Some went to Italy, some went to France. And in the summer of 1944, they settled into the hedgerows of Normandy, set up their scopes, and began scanning the Americans. They found the helmets, they found the jackets, they found the weapons, and they could not find the officers. Not because the Americans were hiding them, not because the officers stayed in the rear. American officers were right there, in the hedgerow, with their men, giving orders, making decisions, leading from the front. But every single visual marker that had worked for 3 years on the Eastern Front was gone. Every one. As if someone had gone through the German sniper's checklist, item by item, and erased each line. Someone had. And it did not start in Normandy. It started 4 years earlier, in a place no German sniper had ever heard of. Between the 2 wars, if you saw an American officer walking down a street in Washington or San Antonio or Fort Benning, you could identify him from a block away. The Sam Browne belt gave him away before anything else. It was a wide leather belt around the waist with a thinner strap that crossed diagonally over the right shoulder. Brown, polished, unmistakable. Only commissioned officers wore it. Enlisted men wore a plain waist belt. The Sam Browne had been adopted from the British during the First World War, and by 1921 it was mandatory for every American officer at all times when not in quarters. For 20 years, it was the single most visible symbol of commissioned rank in the United States Army. You could see it from 200 yards without a scope. It was gone by early 1942. The Army dropped it when the new field uniform replaced the old service coat. The official reason was practical. The new M1941 jacket had its own cloth belt, and the Sam Browne no longer served a functional purpose. But the effect was enormous. Overnight, the most recognizable piece of officer-only equipment in the American military simply ceased to exist. No announcement, no ceremony. 1 year it was regulation. The next year, it was in a drawer. Now pay attention to what replaced it, because this is where the American approach starts to separate from every other army in the war. The M1941 field jacket was issued to every soldier in the United States Army, officer and enlisted, lieutenant and private. The same olive drab cotton shell, the same wool lining, the same talon zipper, the same 4 pockets. There was no officer's version with finer cloth. No tailored cut for commissioned ranks. When a 23-year-old second lieutenant put on his field jacket in England in the spring of '44, he looked identical, from the shoulders down, to the 19-year-old rifleman standing next to him. Now look up. On his head, the M1 steel helmet. One design, one shape, one color. Olive drab, sometimes with a camouflage net stretched over it. No insignia, no colored band. No officer's peaked cap with a polished visor. From private to general, every man in a combat zone wore the same steel pot. A German sniper looking through his scope at a line of Americans saw a row of identical dark green half-spheres. Nothing to distinguish rank, nothing to select a priority target. Contrast this with what was happening in the British Army at exactly the same time. British officers in Normandy still wore uniforms that were visibly different from their men's. The cloth was often finer. Officers frequently purchased their own tunics from private tailors. In the field, British officers still sometimes wore peaked caps or berets of different color than their troops. And the Sam Browne belt, the one the Americans had quietly discarded, remained part of the British officers' kit until 1943, and even after it was officially dropped from field use, many officers continued wearing a leather cross strap out of tradition. The result was exactly what you would expect. German snipers in Normandy found British officers significantly easier to identify than American ones. One account from the Normandy campaign describes a British commanding officer who discovered that his junior officers had taken to wearing roll-neck sweaters pulled up over their collar and tie, hiding the most obvious sign that they were not enlisted men. He ordered them to stop. His words have survived. "If we were to die," he said, "we must die as officers." That sentence is worth pausing on. It captures an entire philosophy, one that most armies in the world shared. The officer's visible distinction was not just practical, it was moral. It was about honor, class, tradition, identity. The idea that an officer should look like an officer was so deeply embedded in military culture that even when snipers were killing them for it, the instinct was to accept the cost rather than erase the distinction. The Americans did not share that instinct. And this is the point where the story goes deeper than uniforms. Because other armies also made adjustments. The Soviets eventually reduced some of their most visible officer markings in '43. The British dropped the Sam Browne from field use. Even the Germans themselves, late in the war, began ordering officers to remove shoulder boards in combat zones. Everyone learned that visible rank got people killed. But these were patches, reactions. Individual measures taken after the damage was done and often resisted by the officers themselves. What the Americans did was different in kind. They did not start with visible officers and then try to hide them. They built a new army, from scratch, between 1940 and 1943, in which the officer was never meant to be visible in the first place. The helmet was not the old helmet with the badge removed. It was a new helmet, designed from the start with no place for a badge. The jacket was not the officer's coat with the Sam Browne taken off. It was a new jacket, designed from the start to be the same for every rank. The system was not retrofitted, it was architected. And the man who architected it, the man who oversaw the design of everything from the training camps to the field manuals to the way a platoon leader carried himself in combat, was the same name from the end of Part 1. Leslie McNair, the commanding general of Army Ground Forces. The man responsible for turning 8 million civilians into soldiers. But removing the uniform markers was only the first layer, because a German sniper who could not find the officer by his clothes could still find him by what he carried. And what an officer carried in every other army in the world was a dead giveaway, in every sense of the word. Think about what a pistol looks like from 200 yards through a telescopic sight. It is small. It sits in a holster on the hip. It does not have a long barrel extending past the shoulder. It does not have a sling. The man who carries a pistol moves differently from the man who carries a rifle. His hands are freer, his silhouette cleaner, his body unencumbered by a long weapon across his chest. To a trained sniper, the pistol is not just a weapon, it is a flag. In the Red Army, the Tokarev TT-33 in its brown leather holster was the most reliable officer marker on the battlefield. Every Soviet officer carried one. Every enlisted man carried a rifle or a submachine gun. The distinction was absolute and visible at distance. German snipers on the Eastern Front knew this so well that the holster alone, a brown shape on the right hip, was enough to justify a shot. In the British Army, officers carried Webley or Enfield revolvers. Same principle. The officer had a short weapon. His men had long ones. From a sniper's position, the difference was unmistakable. In the German army itself, officers carried Walther P38s or Luger P08s. Enlisted men carried Mausers. The same visual grammar, the same distinction, the same vulnerability. Every army accepted this as natural. Officers needed a sidearm for self-defense, and the pistol was lighter than a rifle, leaving the officer's hands free for maps, binoculars, and the work of command. The Americans broke this pattern with a weapon that should not have existed. In June of 1940, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department issued a requirement for something unprecedented: a light rifle. Not a pistol, not a submachine gun, not a full-size battle rifle. Something in between. The specification called for a weapon under 5 pounds, capable of accurate fire to 300 yards, that could be carried on a sling. The weapon that emerged was the M1 carbine. It entered production in mid-1942, and over 6 million were manufactured before the war ended, making it the most produced American weapon of the entire conflict. More than the M1 Garand, more than the Thompson, more than the 1911 pistol. And here is the detail that matters for this story. The carbine was designed, from the very first specification, as a replacement for the pistol. Its primary recipients were officers, NCOs, radio men, drivers, mortar crews, and anyone else who had previously been issued a sidearm. The men who had carried pistols on their hips now carried a light rifle on a sling across their chests. Picture what that looks like through a German sniper's scope. A line of Americans behind a hedgerow. Every man has a long weapon. Some carry the full-length M1 Garand, 36 inches of barrel and stock. Others carry the shorter M1 carbine, still a long arm, still slung on the shoulder, still presenting the same basic silhouette. The difference in length between the two is visible at close range. At 200 yards through a 4-power scope, in the broken light of a Norman hedgerow, it is almost impossible to distinguish. The pistol, the single most reliable visual marker of an officer in every army on Earth, had been removed from the battlefield. Not hidden, not supplemented, replaced. The American officer still had a weapon, but it no longer looked like an officer's weapon. It looked like everyone else's. Now layer this on top of what you already know. Same helmet, same jacket, no Sam Brown belt, and now no pistol. The German sniper has lost 4 items from his checklist in a single glance. But he still has 2 left: the map case and the binoculars. In the Soviet and British armies, the map case was a distinctive leather pouch, brown, flat, worn on the belt or slung across the body. It was officer-issue equipment. Enlisted men did not carry maps. The map case was not just functional. It was a badge. This man reads maps because this man makes decisions. American officers carried maps too, but the American field uniform had 4 large pockets, 2 on the chest, 2 on the hips. A folded map went into a pocket. There was no separate leather case, no visible pouch, no additional piece of equipment hanging from the belt. The map was there, but it was invisible. Binoculars were harder to hide. Officers needed them, and they were bulky. But the American system addressed this too, not by removing binoculars, but by distributing them more widely. Squad leaders, forward observers, NCOs in many roles carried field glasses. Binoculars around a man's neck no longer meant officer. It could mean artillery spotter, platoon sergeant, or a dozen other roles that did not carry the same priority for a sniper. And then there was the most invisible layer of all. Not equipment, not clothing, not a weapon you could see or a pouch you could spot through a scope. It was behavior. The way men moved around each other, the way orders were given, the way an American platoon functioned in the field. Because a German sniper who had lost every visual marker could still, in theory, find the officer by watching how the group behaved. He could look for the man who stood in the center, the man others approached, the man who pointed and everyone followed, the man who received the runner's message. On the Eastern Front, that method worked. Soviet units revolved visibly around their officers. But the Americans had changed something about the way their small units operated, something that went far deeper than equipment, something that made even the behavioral markers unreliable. And that change was not made on a battlefield. It was made in a classroom, 3 years before D-Day, by the man who believed that the best officer was the one you could not find. On the Eastern Front, a German sniper did not always need to see the pistol or the map case. Sometimes he just needed to watch the group for 60 seconds, because in the Red Army, the officer was the center of gravity. He was the man who decided. He was the man who moved first. He was the man the others watched before they did anything at all. Soviet doctrine in 1941 concentrated decision-making in the officer to a degree that Western armies would have found extreme. Platoon-level initiative, the idea that a sergeant or a corporal could make a tactical decision on his own, was not just uncommon, it was dangerous. In the Red Army, acting without an order could mean a tribunal. The result was a unit that functioned like a wheel with a single hub. Every action radiated from the officer. Every pause waited for his word. And when a sniper removed that hub, the wheel stopped turning. German snipers internalized this. They learned that even if you could not see the insignia, you could find the officer by watching the human geometry, the man at the center, the man others gravitated toward, the man who moved and triggered movement in everyone around him. When those snipers turned their scopes on American infantry in the summer of '44, the geometry was wrong. There was no single hub. The Americans did not orient around one man the way Soviet platoons did. They moved in smaller clusters. Orders seemed to pass laterally, one man to the next, rather than radiating from a center. When the group paused, there was no single figure studying the terrain while others waited. Multiple men looked. Multiple men pointed. The decision-making was distributed across the group in a way that made the leader structurally invisible. This was not natural. Soldiers do not instinctively organize themselves this way. It was trained. And it was trained deliberately, in a network of camps across the American South and Southwest, under a system that one man designed from the ground up. Leslie McNair took command of Army Ground Forces in March of 1942. His job was to take millions of civilians, factory workers, farmers, students, clerks, and turn them into an army capable of fighting the Wehrmacht. He had 3 years of other people's wars to study. He had the reports from the Eastern Front. He had the British experience in North Africa. And he drew a conclusion that shaped everything he built. In modern war, the small unit must function, even when its leader is gone. That single idea drove the entire training doctrine. American platoons were trained so that if the lieutenant went down, the platoon sergeant took over without hesitation. If the sergeant went down, a corporal stepped forward. If the corporal went down, a private first class led the squad. The chain of succession was not just a contingency plan written in a manual. It was practiced, in the field, under simulated fire, hundreds of times before a unit shipped overseas. But here is what matters for the sniper's problem. A unit trained to function without its leader does not behave like a unit that depends on its leader. The officer does not need to be the visible center. He does not need to stand where everyone can see him. He does not need to gesture, to point, to be the one man moving when everyone else is still. He gives an order to his sergeant. The sergeant passes it down. The platoon moves. And through a scope at 200 yards, no one can tell who started it. McNair demanded something else that amplified this effect. Something that sounds minor but changed the shape of every American unit on the battlefield. He insisted on what the Army called combat realistic training. Units did not drill on parade grounds. They trained in terrain that resembled where they would fight: woods, hills, rivers, hedgerows. They trained with live ammunition fired over their heads. And officers were graded not on how commanding they looked, but on how effectively their units performed when the officers themselves were pulled from the exercise without warning. The message was unmistakable. You are not the show. Your men are the show. If your platoon falls apart when you are removed, you have failed. If it keeps moving, you have succeeded. The best American officers learned to lead from inside the formation, not from the front of it. They learned to command with a quiet word, not a pointed arm. They learned to be present without being prominent. And then there was the simplest behavioral measure of all, the one that every American soldier learned in his first week of training and never forgot. Do not salute an officer in a combat zone. The rule was absolute. In garrison, in camp, behind the lines, in England before the invasion, you saluted. In the field, within range of enemy observation, you did not. The salute was the most direct advertisement of rank on a battlefield. One man raises his hand to his temple, the other man returns it, and every sniper within 400 yards now knows which one gives the orders. The Americans eliminated it entirely. In its place, nothing. No substitute gesture, no modified greeting. An officer walked past and you did nothing that would distinguish your interaction with him from your interaction with any other man in the unit. Soldiers who forgot were corrected sharply, and the correction carried a phrase that survived the war and is still used in the American military today. Don't sniper check me. So by the summer of '44, a German sniper in Normandy faced an enemy that had stripped away every layer of identification he had ever been trained to read. The uniform was identical. The helmet was identical. The weapon was a long arm, not a pistol. The map was in a pocket. The binoculars were everywhere. No one was being saluted. And the unit did not revolve around a visible center. But Normandy would test this system in a way that no training camp could simulate. And the test came in the worst possible terrain, a landscape that turned every sniper into a ghost. The bocage began a few hundred yards inland from the Normandy beaches, and it stretched south for 60 miles. Hedgerow country, fields the size of a football pitch, each one enclosed by earthen walls 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense brush and trees that had been growing for centuries. The walls were so thick that a tank could not push through them. The brush was so dense that a man standing on one side could not see the field on the other. For a sniper, it was the best terrain on earth. A German marksman could climb into the root system of a hedgerow, nestle into the earth and branches, and have a clear line of sight across an entire field, 100, 200 yards of open ground that any attacking American unit would have to cross. He was invisible. His muzzle flash was swallowed by the foliage. The sound of his shot bounced off the dense walls and could not be located. He could fire, wait, fire again, and the Americans in the open would not know where the bullet was coming from. One American platoon leader's account from that summer describes the effect in terms that still carry weight 8 decades later. He ordered a squad to advance from one hedgerow to the next, a movement of perhaps 80 yards. A single sniper round hit one man. The entire squad dropped to the ground. And the sniper, firing from a fixed position, picked them off one by one as they lay motionless in the grass. The platoon leader watched it happen and could do nothing. German snipers killed hundreds of Americans in the hedgerows. They were devastating. They slowed advances to a crawl. They made men afraid to stand up, afraid to move, afraid to cross any open space. They created a psychological weight that hung over every unit in the bocage. But there is a fact buried in those terrible weeks that the casualty reports reveal only if you know what to look for. The Germans were killing Americans. They were not, in disproportionate numbers, killing American officers. In armies where officers were visually identifiable, sniper fire created a specific and catastrophic problem: leadership decapitation. Kill the lieutenant, and the platoon stalls. Kill 2 lieutenants in a week, and the company starts making mistakes. Kill enough company commanders, and the battalion loses its ability to coordinate. The effect cascades upward. A handful of well-placed sniper kills can degrade an entire regiment's effectiveness without ever engaging its main body. On the Eastern Front, this is exactly what happened. German snipers did not need to kill large numbers of Soviets. They needed to kill the right ones. And the visual identification system made finding the right ones almost trivially easy. In Normandy, the German snipers were just as skilled. Their marksmanship was just as lethal. Their concealment was, if anything, better. The hedgerows gave them positions that the open steppes never could. But they were firing into a formation where they could not identify priority targets. Every American looked the same, so they shot whoever was visible: the man who raised his head, the man who moved first, the man who was unlucky. Random targets: privates, corporals, riflemen. Men whose loss was tragic, but whose absence did not paralyze the unit. And when a sniper did happen to hit an American officer, by chance, not by selection, the unit did not stall. The sergeant took over, or the corporal, or the next man in line, because that is what they had been trained to do in those camps back in the States under McNair's system. The wheel had no single hub. Remove one spoke, and the others held. This was not invisible to the Germans. Their own intelligence reports from the summer of '44 note, with a tone approaching frustration, that American units recovered from losses faster than expected, that leadership seemed to regenerate, that killing one man did not produce the paralysis that the same shot would have caused on the Eastern Front. They were describing the effect without fully understanding the cause. They could see that something was different. They could not see what it was, because what it was the absence of something. The absence of every marker they had been trained to rely on. The absence of a visible hierarchy on the battlefield. And while the German snipers in the hedgerows were firing blind, their counterparts facing British and Canadian units a few miles to the east, around Caen, were having a different experience. British officers were still more identifiable. Not as obviously as the Soviets had been. The British had learned some lessons. But the cultural resistance to full equalization meant that small differences persisted. A slightly different beret, a subtly better tunic, a tendency to cluster at command positions. Enough for a trained eye at 200 yards. British officer casualties in Normandy were disproportionately high. In some infantry battalions, the rate of officer losses outpaced enlisted losses by a significant margin. German snipers were finding their targets. The Americans were dying too. War is not a controlled experiment, and a bullet does not check your rank before it kills you. But the pattern was different. American officers were dying at roughly the same rate as their men, not at a higher one. They were not being selected. They were not being hunted. They were casualties of the same random violence that killed everyone. And their units, when they fell, kept moving. Somewhere in those hedgerows, in late July of '44, the man who had built this system decided he needed to see it for himself. Not from a headquarters, not from a map room in England, from the front line, in a foxhole, under fire. Leslie McNair had done this before, and the last time, it had nearly killed him. In April of 1943, 14 months before D-Day, Leslie McNair went to North Africa to observe his army in its first real fight against the Germans. He did not go as a tourist. He went forward, past the division headquarters, past the regimental command post, into the artillery observation positions where the shells were landing. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, whether the men he had trained were performing the way his system intended. He had spent 2 years building a training machine that processed divisions like an assembly line. Basic training, unit training, combined arms exercises, live fire maneuvers. And now that machine's output was in combat for the first time, in the hills and passes of Tunisia. He found what he was looking for, but he also found a German shell. On April 23, 1943, a fragment from an artillery round struck McNair while he was observing near the front. The wound was serious enough to earn him a Purple Heart and an evacuation, but the lasting damage was worse than the scar. The blast left him partially deaf in both ears, a condition the Army kept secret for the rest of his life. That deafness cost him the command he had spent 40 years building toward. When the time came to choose generals for the invasion of Europe, Eisenhower considered McNair for a field army or an army group. But a commander who could not hear clearly in a meeting, who could not follow a radio transmission without difficulty, could not lead 100,000 men in combat. The job went to others. Omar Bradley got 1st Army. Patton got 3rd Army. McNair, the man who had trained them all, was left without a command. What he got instead was a ghost. In the summer of '44, McNair was assigned to command the 1st United States Army Group. It did not exist. FUSAG was a fiction, a phantom army of rubber tanks, fake radio traffic, and decoy camps, created to convince the Germans that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. The role required a general senior enough that the Germans would believe the deception. McNair, with his 3 stars and his reputation, fit the part. But McNair did not come to Europe to command an army made of air. He came to do what he had always done: go forward, watch his men fight, and find out whether his training system worked. He arrived in Normandy in mid-July, 7 weeks into the campaign. The hedgerow fighting was at its worst. American casualties were mounting. The front had barely moved since D-Day. Bradley's 1st Army was planning an operation to break the deadlock, a massive, concentrated blow that would punch through the German lines south of St. Lo and open the road to Brittany and the French interior. The operation was called Cobra. Its centerpiece was not a ground assault. It was an air assault, the largest use of heavy bombers in direct support of ground troops that the war had yet seen. More than 1,500 B-17 and B-24s would carpet bomb a narrow strip of German positions along the St. Lo road, obliterating the defenses and allowing the infantry and armor to pour through the gap. McNair wanted to watch it happen, not from a hilltop miles behind the lines, from the front, from a foxhole within sight of where the bombs would fall. He went forward on July 24th, the day Cobra was originally scheduled to begin. He traveled without fanfare, no motorcade, no staff car with stars on the bumper, no cluster of aides marking him as a senior officer. He wore the same uniform as every soldier around him, the same M1 helmet, the same field jacket, no visible rank insignia. He carried no map case on his belt. He settled into a slit trench near the forward positions of the 30th Infantry Division, a few hundred yards behind the planned bomb line, and waited for the sky to open. A 3-star general, responsible for training the largest army the United States had ever fielded, was sitting in a foxhole that looked exactly like every other foxhole on that line. The men around him, if they noticed him at all, saw another officer in olive drab, another steel helmet, another man waiting for something to happen. The system he had built was so complete that it had erased even him. On July 24th, the weather turned bad. Low clouds rolled in over the target area. Some bomber groups were recalled. Others did not receive the recall in time and dropped their payloads anyway. Several sticks of bombs fell short, not on the German positions, but on the American lines. 25 Americans were killed. Over 100 were wounded. McNair survived. The operation was postponed by 1 day. Bradley ordered the bombers to try again on July 25th with a corrected approach, this time flying parallel to the road, not perpendicular, to reduce the risk of shorts. McNair did not go back to the rear. He stayed in his foxhole. He had come to see his army fight, and he was not leaving until he saw it. On the morning of July 25th, 1944, the sky above Saint-Lô filled with aircraft. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, 550 fighter bombers, the largest close air support mission of the Second World War. The sound was so enormous that men on the ground described it as physical, a vibration in the chest, a pressure in the skull, a noise beyond noise. The first bombs hit the German lines. Then the second wave came in. Then the third. And then the pattern began to drift. The bombs walked south across the German positions in a rolling thunder of 500-pound explosions that turned the earth into dust, and the dust into a brown fog that rose 1,000 feet into the air. But the smoke from the first wave obscured the target markers for the second wave, and the second wave smoke blinded the third. Bombardiers in the trailing aircraft could no longer see the road that was supposed to be their reference line. They released early. Hundreds of bombs fell short. They landed not on the Germans, but on the American positions north of the road. On the foxholes of the 30th Infantry Division, on the slit trenches where men were pressed into the earth, helmets down, hands over their heads, waiting for the storm to pass over them and fall on the enemy. One bomb landed in, or directly beside, the foxhole where Leslie McNair was sheltering. The blast killed him instantly. His body was thrown roughly 80 feet from the trench. When soldiers found what remained, the damage was so severe that identification required his West Point class ring and the 3 stars on his collar, the same rank insignia he had kept hidden from every German who might have been watching. 111 Americans died in the short bombing that morning. Nearly 500 were wounded. Among the dead, McNair was the highest-ranking American soldier killed in the European theater in the entire war. And his death was kept secret, not because of grief, because of the Ghost Army. McNair was still officially the commander of FUSAG, the fictional army group that was keeping 15 German divisions pinned at Pas de Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. If the Germans learned that McNair was dead in Normandy, they would know FUSAG was a deception, and those 15 divisions would be released to reinforce the crumbling front. So Eisenhower buried the news. McNair was interred quietly at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. No announcement, no state funeral. The man who had trained the entire army vanished from the record as completely as his system had made officers vanish from the battlefield. His grave is there today. Plot F, row 28, grave 42. A white marble cross identical to every other cross in that cemetery. No special marker, no monument. Just a name, a rank, and a date. The same stone, the same size, the same spacing as the private buried next to him. Even in death, the system held. Think back to that German sniper in the hedgerow south of Saint-Lô. He lies in his position, scope steady, scanning the Americans. He is looking for the man who matters, the officer, the leader, the decision-maker. He has been trained to find that man by 6 markers: the belt, the helmet, the uniform, the pistol, the map case, and the behavior. He has killed dozens of Soviet officers using those markers. He is very good at what he does. And he is looking at an army that has erased all 6. The belt is gone, eliminated 3 years before the invasion. The helmet is identical for every rank. The uniform is the same jacket, the same cloth, the same cut. The pistol has been replaced by a carbine that looks like a shorter rifle. The map is in a pocket. And the unit does not revolve around one visible man, it moves like a network, not a wheel, with no hub a scope can find. He fires. He hits a rifleman. The unit keeps moving. Someone else gives the next order. He cannot tell who. That is what made American officers invisible to German snipers. Not one decision, not one piece of equipment, not one regulation. A system, 6 layers deep, designed from scratch, built into the army before it ever saw combat. Every other army in the war tried to hide its officers after snipers started killing them. The Americans built an army where there was nothing to hide. It was not a coincidence that this system came from a nation that had no aristocratic military tradition to protect, no officer class rooted in centuries of social hierarchy, no deep belief that a leader must look like a leader to be one. The Americans could erase the visible line between officer and enlisted man because, in some fundamental way, they had never believed the line was sacred. And the man who understood that best, who turned it from instinct into doctrine, from culture into system, died in a foxhole wearing the same helmet as everyone else, invisible to the last. If you've made it to the end of this story, I want to say something simple. Thank you. These videos take weeks of research to put together, and the reason I keep making them is because of people like you who watch all the way through and care about getting the history right. If you think this story deserves to find more viewers, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this is worth recommending to someone else who cares about World War II history. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd be honored to have you. Hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great uncle, I'd be grateful if you'd share their story. Every one of them matters. I'll see you in the next one.